have a basic distrust of anyone who is not Jewish, certainly Arabs, certainly Muslims, and certainly Palestinians. And it's very harmful to discuss peace in this way. The second is really the absence of the Palestinian narrative from Israeli discourse and Israeli history textbooks. The way we are taught it in school, it's almost as if our grandparents came to a virtually empty land. Have you ever heard the expression, a land without a people, for a people without a land? What is this? What is this myth? There were people there. They were called the Palestinians. And we are taught it in this way, as if our grandparents came to an empty land, settled it. We have an expression in Hebrew, making the desert blossom. And I'm not saying that our grandparents didn't contribute a lot to the state and didn't develop agriculture, but they weren't the only ones who were doing it. There were Palestinians who were doing it for many years also, before the great immigration began in the late 1800s and 1900s. So this is certainly a problem, and it's a problem now also in the peace negotiations, because the fact that most Israelis don't acknowledge that not only Jews have a right to a state, but also Palestinians have a right to a state, is very problematic to the peace process, because, for example, you'll see when people talk about the disengagement from Gaza or from the West Bank, Israelis use words like, we gave them Gaza. What do you mean we gave them Gaza, I want to ask Israelis? They have a right to Gaza in the same way that you have a right to Israel. Both peoples have rights to land in this area. And Israelis don't acknowledge that, and they see us disengaging from the territories as acts of generosity, which is very, very problematic. And the last two things really are that Israelis passionately feel that the Israeli army is the most moral army in the world. You'll hear a lot of Israelis say this. They're very proud about it. And a lot of times as a refusal, you'll hear this. Israelis will tell you things like, we're very considerate. We drop leaflets before we bomb them from above. Or we give them notes before we demolish their homes. We are a good army. We act very morally. We do the best that we can. And I think our best is not good enough, not for me anyway, not for my ethical code. And generally, I'm not arguing the Israeli army is worse or better than any army. I just think all armies are very problematic. And I think being so self-righteous and so unwilling to criticize our army is very problematic. Also,
next, a woman who has received national attention after her appearance on Jon Stewart's The Daily Show with former Palestinian minister Mustafa Barghouti. Her name is Anna Balter, and she wrote Witness in Palestine. The book was mentioned by Jon Stewart a couple times on the program, and the next day shot up to #1 in sales in Amazon.com's Human Rights book division. We have selections from an interview I did with Anna Balter in 2006. I'm speaking with Anna Balter, who just gave a fantastic talk in Guilford, Connecticut, about her experiences in the Palestinian territories. Hi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
A bit about your background to start.
I'm a Jewish American, and I got into this work when I was teaching English in Turkey. I graduated from Columbia University and on a Fulbright scholarship was in Asia Minor, and I would kind of take trips through the Middle East, and that's when I first started meeting people in Syria and Lebanon and Iran who sort of started to teach me things about the Israel-Palestine conflict that I'd never heard growing up as a Jewish American. That's how I went from being sort of Jewish American who didn't know much about the Palestinian narrative to working in the territories.
And then eventually you wrote a book.
That's right. After spending 5 months working with a group called the International Women's Peace Service, which documents human rights abuses in the area and supports Palestinians in their nonviolent resistance to the occupation, having spent 5 months there, I got a lot of sort of positive feedback from the sort of emails that I would write back really to my family and friends, such that it was actually good material for a book. I used my photographs and my blog entries to actually make a sort of real narrative, you know, going through.
Why don't you hold the book cover up?
It's called Witness in Palestine, Journal of a Jewish American Woman in the Occupied Territories. And basically, like I said, I mean, it's full of photographs and as well as sort of the things that I started, the things that I saw, you know, my observations, you know, coming as a Jewish American, what things looked like to me. I'd spent time in Israel, I spent time in Palestine, and sort of giving voice to Palestinians whose stories are often never heard, never told in mainstream media in this country.
I want to talk to you about the things you saw. First, what were the dates you were over there?
I originally went for the first time to Palestine. I'd been to Israel before, but to Palestine in late 2003. I stayed for 2 months into early 2004, and then I went back in mid-2005 for 3 months last year. And now I was in Palestine one final time in January during the elections in 2006.
All right, we don't have a lot of time, so we're going to just hit one thing after another. Tell me about checkpoints.
Well, one of the main surprises that I found when I was in Palestine was that I had originally thought that checkpoints, where Palestinians are basically screened by the Israeli military, I had assumed that they were sort of on the border between Palestine and Israel, Palestinian territories and Israel, and it turns out that the vast majority of these checkpoints are not located around the border, but actually within the Palestinian territories, between Palestinian towns and villages, which means that Palestinians cannot go from their village to the nearest city or to the village next door without often being screened, held up for hours, an entire day even. So it's preventing Palestinians from sort of getting an education, getting to classes, going to work, getting to the hospital in a timely manner, going to a funeral, anything so Palestinians, their daily lives are not able to sort of function normally because of these checkpoints.
And you told a really terrible story about a woman trying to give birth.
Yeah, outside of the village of Deir Balut, the checkpoint there, it's anyone who wants to leave the village has to pass through it, and it's open from 7 a.m. until 7 p.m. But that means that anyone who has any kind of emergency after 7 p.m., is kind of out of luck. And what happened was this woman, she was 7 months pregnant with twins, began to have contractions in the middle of the night. Her husband drove her to the checkpoint, which they needed to cross to reach the nearest city of Ramallah, where the nearest hospital was. And the soldiers came down and they said basically, look, the rule's very clear. Palestinians can't cross until 7 in the morning. Come back at 7. Well, they couldn't wait 6 hours, and eventually they kind of had an ambulance come from Ramallah to the checkpoint, hoping that then the woman could just go from her own car to the ambulance and be shuttled back to Ramallah. But that still didn't work. And the soldiers, they were like, we didn't make the rules, but look, we're just following orders. That's all we're doing. And they kept saying, we're just following orders, we're just following orders. And anyway, eventually they were able to contact somebody to finally allow this woman through, but she'd been waiting for 2 hours. And when she eventually gave birth to the twins in the ambulance, the twins were born alive, but they were desperately in need of hospital care because they were premature. And because they'd been waiting for 2 hours at the checkpoint, they weren't able to reach the hospital in time, and both of the women's babies died, actually.
For more of the interview, go to our website. The U.S. Congress has voted to declare the Earth flat and at the center of the universe. That's how I entitled my report about the disgusting, overwhelming vote of the U.S. House of Lickspittles to condemn the Goldstone Report. The Goldstone Report was a study done by a Jewish South African judge detailing deftly how Israel massacred Palestinians last winter in the Gaza Strip. The Congress and the President are doing everything they can to cover up what went on there. That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller, and this is The Struggle.